Everybody, this is St. Mary's Orthodox Church in Falls Church, Adult Catechism 2023. On this festive day in the life of the United States, we are celebrating the annular eclipse over much of the Southwest that took place earlier today. So I, in the spirit of things, have allowed myself the nimbus of an annular eclipse, which notice is filled with darkness because I'm not illumined with light. I am a shadow of sin over the light of goodness. That's how I understand myself living in the flesh. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, but more about that maybe next week. But today we're going to talk about what does it actually mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be created? Last week, we kind of started on the subject of creation when we talked about the first article of the Creed, the first paragraph, if you will. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. Today's lesson is kind of a continuity with that and setting forward for us a proper understanding of both cosmology and anthropology. Normally, you think about theology, you think about doctrines about God, but in Orthodoxy, it's equally true and valid to say that you have to have a correct understanding of mankind and creation in order to have proper Orthodox doctrine. It's not just theology, it's also anthropology and cosmology. So we're going to get into that a little bit today. This will all help us, especially with the next class on sin, will help kind of set the whole story of what's the problem, what needs to be solved, how God has solved that, etc., that we're going to start to get into when we get into Christology. But let's start with creation. You'll hear in the Orthodox Church from the Psalms, "In wisdom hast thou made them all." We sing this or chant this in some form from Psalm 103 at the beginning of Vespers. The services of the Orthodox Church begin in the evening because creation began from darkness to light. There was darkness and then there was light. So we start as the sun sets and go towards the sunrise. And so Vespers starts with the story of creation. And that includes all the beautiful things. The first thing that especially when you notice as you read Psalm 103, the lesson and the message that's coming through that is that God created the world out of love. Out of just charity, generosity, desire to make beauty, not because he had to, not because it was something required out of his essence, or not by accident. In the ancient world and in throughout many cultures throughout the world, if you look at their cosmogony, their origins of the cosmos mythologies, very often the created world is by accident, the accident of the gods. And or humanity is an accident that kind of plopped somewhere on the battlefield and was left behind. That's the opposite in Genesis, which demonstrates a very intentional, loving, caring, appreciating artsmanship, craftsmanship, and artisanship of God the Creator. So he creates out of love, not out of necessity or by accident. He created everything from nothing, which in Latin, you'll hear the term ex nihilo, from nothing. In John 1, we read, "All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made." This is the way that the Bible explains ex nihilo. Again, in the ancient world, or in maybe many contemporary ways of thinking, which are kind of loosely based on scientific thinking, the idea is that matter always somehow has been, or primordial matter has always been, and out of it, it's somehow organized or something like that. And in the ancient myths, very often there was chaos was the thing that existed first. And then eventually some type of being or God or whatever came and kind of put it in order. In Genesis, again, it takes a very distinct departure from those mythologies. And while it recognizes that you start from a place of kind of relative chaos or emptiness, that's something even that God kind of brings into being, the unformed that he creates so that he can form it, and the empty things so that he can fill them with content. And if you look at the story of Genesis in particular, the first chapter it basically uses this concept of form and emptiness to explain what's happening in the days of creation. It's not meant to be read like a scientific textbook, like in the Paleolithic age and the Pleistocene age and the et cetera age. That's not the kind of things that it's talking about. It's talking about a basic concept of moving from disorder to order, from emptiness to fullness. And if you want to know more about that, I do have some classes on this subject in Religion on the Apostles playlist that you can check out on our YouTube channel. For example, St. Paul uses this teaching about God as the creator when he's talking to the men. I'm not sure if this was, which one was this? This is, I think, when he got shipwrecked or something, or is this when he got, I can't remember now if this is when he was in the prison or whatever. But in any case, he's doing miracles by the grace of God, and they think he's a God, and they want to bow down and worship him. And he says, why are you doing these things? Me and Barnabas here, we're men with the same nature as you. We preach to you that you should turn from created things, useless things, to the living God who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are there within. The fundamental task of the Torah, of the Old Testament, was teaching people to worship the Creator, not the created, and moving in the right direction. This is a continuing theme, of course, throughout much of what we're going to talk about, and in a sense plays a role even throughout the doctrines, development of doctrines of the church, especially not just obviously with like iconography, but even with Arianism and things like that we're going to take a look at. Now, another typical way of thinking about, if you do hold to an intelligent designer type of idea or creator idea, we still seem to be, the materialist worldview seems indebted still to the kind of the deist worldview of the Enlightenment, which treated God as basically like a great clockmaker. Like he created a machine that he wound up and set to run, right? Like you wind up a clock and you let it go until it, winds down. From the Orthodox and the biblical point of view, though, God does not simply wind up the clock and leave it behind, but he's constantly keeping it moving. He's the wind behind the sails. He's the thing that makes creation continue to thrive and to grow, to continue to demonstrate order, et cetera, et cetera. So the Lord will say to those who wonder about him working on the Sabbath, he says, my Father is working until now, and I also am working. God, even when he's resting on a Sabbath day, so to speak, is still upholding the universe by the word of his command, by the breath of his Spirit. So this is another important thing. God is not distant from creation, but like Alec Guinness said about the Force, it penetrates us, it moves through all of us. It gives us life, et cetera, et cetera. Miracles are not intrusions, therefore, from a distant God who's interrupting the normal concourse of the world. From an Orthodox point of view, miracles are simply God continuing to do what he normally does, just in a slightly counterintuitive or unusual manner. But it's not an unnatural thing. And to a certain extent, you could call it supernatural because God is beyond nature. But it's not paranormal, okay? We're not treated as something strange or unusual, but simply a manifestation of his continuing goodness and his love. So again, working a little different. When we use the term natural law is a term that really comes to us more, I would say, through like the scholastics and the Western tradition. You don't see the term natural law used as much in the Eastern Fathers. You might occasionally find it. But that tends to be it has its own kind of philosophical pedigree. I won't digress too far into that. But when we use the term natural law, it's just another description of how God works through his creation in a normal or predictable way. I was mentioned this on Wednesday night, but I was listening to this wonderful, I think it's Universal History podcast with Jonathan Pageau and Richard Rowland. And Richard makes the really good point that it's not that people didn't know gravity existed before Newton, right? They understood that apples fall from trees, et cetera, et cetera. But the way that they might have phrased it or described it was in terms of the earth is apple, or the apple is made out of earth, and so it is naturally attracted to the earth, and so it moves towards the earth. Whereas maybe they would have said something like birds have an element quality of air and therefore they're more attracted to the air. Some way of explaining things using the idea of love, law of attraction, law of desire, law of sympathy, whatever you want to call it. That's where sympathetic magic comes from. And the kind of the figures like Newton and the rest start to describe the flow of things in terms of laws. But Richard made the point, like he liked the medieval way of looking at the world as being governed by love and attraction, as opposed to a bunch of rules and regulations, which is very much the kind of the modern worldview, right? Put everything in order and ticket you if you get it out of line. So in any case, it's just the universe doesn't have laws or law books or courts or anything like that. So even calling things natural laws is a kind of a metaphorical conceit that we as humans use to organize our descriptions. So the Bible does talk about things in terms of law, but never in the sense of it just exists in and of itself. The world is governed by principles, by orderly rules, because it has this overarching and underlying at the same time logos, or reason, that comes from God himself. So God's wisdom permeates the entire universe, as we'll see, such that the Bible can say the heavens declare the glory of God, right? The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament, or the sky, show us his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There's no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Now, this is a perfectly sensible thing for someone coming from a biblical cosmology, a biblical worldview. I understand that when I see the heavens, when I look into the skies, when I look at the earth, when I see the solar bodies, there is wisdom being declared to me, that there is some order to the universe, that there is a good and loving creator that is making the world a predictable, safe kind of place to generally to live in. The materialist, having jettisoned that worldview, kind of looks at it and says, space dust and rocks. It doesn't really know what to do with it. And then this doesn't even make sense in that worldview, because having lost that biblical worldview, what do you make of this? Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens. This is again drawing upon a cosmology which is deep and abiding, which connects us with the beauty of all creation, that our little life on earth manifests this incredible heavenly life above, or as the alchemists, I guess, and others said, as above, so below. But I think modern man is still struggling with this and grappling with this. You might have remembered that the most important spaceship captain of all time did actually finally go to space, William Shatner. And he was extremely moved by his experience of being in space. He was filled with grief for what he saw, the kind of like looking and seeing the smallness of Earth and the vastness of space, and how we seem to be squandering our time and our energies here. But he also had this sense of the kind of the magnificence of the vastness of space and so forth. And so that, trying to find a way to express that, you could see that he was driven to almost, religious terms about it. Like he said, space dust we are, and unto space dust we will return, and things like that. But, we are still trying to figure this out as human beings. And hopefully today, the annular eclipse, again, which you see behind me, is something that will inspire people to take the vision of creation more seriously again. In fact, this is very much a part of the language of our services. And God willing, in baptism, for those who are going to be baptized, you'll hear these words from the Psalms. Many, Lord my God, are the wonders you have done, the things you have planned for us. None can compare with you. Were I to speak and tell of your deeds, they would be too many to declare. We have the similar language in the end of the Gospel of John, right? If all the things that Christ did were to be recorded, not even the world would be able to hold the books. But very beautifully, this whole idea of creation, I think, is most succinctly expressed liturgically by the church in her baptismal prayer for the blessing of the waters. Great are you, O Lord, and your works are marvelous, and there are no words which will suffice to hymn your wonders. And we say that chanting it boldly 3 times. And then we say, for by your will, you have out of nothingness brought all things into being. By your power, you sustain all creation, and by your providence, you direct the world. So this is a beautiful explication right there, just a simple prayer of God's abiding presence in the creation, that he continues to fill it with his love, with his wisdom, with his direction, with his giving of life. The prayer continues saying, from the 4 elements you have formed the creation and have crowned the cycle of the year with 4 seasons. So the 4 elements, the 4 seasons was kind of ancient medieval cosmology. All the spiritual powers tremble before you. And notice what are considered spiritual powers. The sun praises you. The moon glorifies you. The stars in their courses meet with you. The light hearkens unto you. The depths shudder at your presence. The springs of water serve you. You stretch out your heavens like a tent. You built your palace on the waters above. You set the bounds of the sands of the sea. You poured forth the air for breathing. So the entire cosmos is encapsulated in the blessing of waters. When we pray, we're praying simply that the blessedness that God gave to his creation be kind of focused and actualized in a meaningful, powerful way in the waters of baptism. We're not asking for some special water that's somehow fundamentally different from the rest of creation. It's simply being restored to the fullness of what that water was called to be when it was created, which is also true of our humanity. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, the son of man that thou visitest him? This is what the Psalms ask. This is also quoted in the book of Hebrews, talking about the Son of Man who became a little lower than the angels, but was crowned with glory and honor. But what is mankind that God should care about him? First of all, we understand from the book of Genesis that we were created to have dominion, to fill the earth, and some translations say subdue, some say conquer, others. I like the concept of dominion because that represents the fullness of the meaning you fill the earth and you bring it to order. Remember form and emptiness? This is the same concept. You are now participating in the creative work of God to bring order and fullness to life. So fill the earth by multiplying and put it under your dominion. Give it order. So it's a caretaking task. It's not one that's meant to be exploitative. The kind of the modern worldview in materialism sees the world as not having any essential value outside of utilitarian value, right? It has no sacred quality to itself. So you, of course, exploit the natural environment for whatever you need, as far as you can get away with it, essentially. Humanity is also, therefore, the best expressions of what we talk about when we say he created the visible and the invisible. We live in both realities, within the visible sensory reality, the physical reality of our bodies and the things that we physically interact with, but also that noetic reality of our soul, which seeks beyond the simply or merely physical. We are wonderfully and fearfully made. Man is an interior, infinite universe. This is a concept that is found within the Fathers, but beautifully expressed by a modern father of mine, spiritual father of mine, Father Roman Braga, that we'll look at towards the end of this lesson, who described the human being as an infinite or an inner universe, and that the human being is not a microcosm of the vast sensible world, but actually the visible world is the microcosm, because it's quite limited by what we can see and what we can measure, and but the human being is actually beyond that, is even bigger than that. And within the soul exists the possibility for not just the cosmos, but really truly a multiverse of possibilities. All right. We do see the concept of the nature of humanity, and this is important because what does it mean for Christ to have our nature or take on human nature. If you don't have the right understanding of human nature, this can get very befuddled and has led to various heresies throughout the history of the church. For example, in 1 Corinthians 10, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. The common to man is one word in Greek, anthropocene, which is basically what is human. To be human. To be human means to be susceptible to temptation. It doesn't mean necessarily the same thing as to be automatically a sinner, which is an important point. St. James says Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. He was an anthropon homeopathes. He was a human being subject to the same passions, subject to the same changes or sufferings. So we have no excuse if we're not faithful in our prayers. Elijah could do incredible things, and he was just a simple man. In 1 Corinthians 3, we hear this. St. Paul says, "For you are still carnal, for there are envy, strife, and divisions among you. Where those are you not carnal and behaving like mere men?" This is one of these interesting ones we're translating from the Greek. You see a lot of different ones. Kind of literally it is, are you not walking in the way of men, or walking in a manly way, or something like that is kind of the literal version. Mere man, I don't like that, because it's making a judgment call upon men, because I don't know if I know what that means to be a mere man, right? But what it's saying is walking in the way of men, as in your fellow kind of fleshly men. And so this term carnal is really important. We're going to talk a lot more about this when we talk about sin. But in some translations, this idea of sarkiki, or from sarx, flesh in Greek, is translated sin nature or sinful nature. This is a very problematic translation, and basically, I think, leads to heretical thinking about Christology. Because how does Christ take on our human nature if our human nature has a sin nature to it? It's a problematic problem. Christ made himself of no reputation, or literally emptied himself, taking upon himself the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men, assumed. So somehow he becomes like us in all ways except sin, but he certainly assumes everything that we are. And we're going to talk a lot about what does the incarnation mean for Orthodox doctrine when we get to that class. Some other concepts that we should be aware of. The word itself, anthropos, is kind of a funny word in Greek. It means basically man face or man's eyes. And it suggests the top, right? Look, the fact that man faces upwards, the man's eyes look up. He is not an animal looking down on the ground, like a dog sniffing or a cow grazing, right? The thing that makes man a slightly different animal is that he has this upward view of things. And this is understood by the fathers in particular as kind of a metaphorical spiritual thing, that man looks beyond the carnal world, the sensory world, and looks towards the spiritual. So he's naturally religious, naturally seeking something beyond himself. By fixating, though, on the physical, our view becomes distorted. We become afraid of death, right? We become obsessed with our health, with our finances. We're terrified of sickness. We're terrified of becoming disabled. We would rather, commit suicide than suffer, a diminishment of our lives. And it becomes a very difficult and dark world in which we live if all we see are those things. And so the net result is that we end up hiding from death, and we hide our dying from view. One of the most powerful things, and we won't really talk about this too much in depth until we finally get to the very end of catechesis when we talk about funerals and memorials. But Orthodoxy does not shy away from death. I remember when I was in my undergraduate years, I read, who was it? Ernst Becker, The Denial of Death. Is kind of an existentialist thinker from the 20th century. And And I really liked all the points he was making, because I'm like, yeah, people deny death all the time, and that's real bad. But then when you look at orthodoxy says, look into the grave. Look at your body when it dies. Look at what happens at this life. This is not all there is. But it doesn't say, pretend that doesn't happen, right? It makes you take a good hard look at our own mortality and what are you willing to die for? What are you willing to live for? But more importantly, what are you willing to die for? And in Hebrews, one of the most important verses in the New Testament for us to understand a lot of this stuff and a lot of what Christ was doing. Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of the flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same. He took on our human nature, our flesh and blood, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and release those who through the fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So again, we'll talk about this more next time, but again, the fear of death becomes a source of bondage. And if you understand the kind of the key event in the Torah, right, is the Exodus, is the rescue from slavery, is a rescue from bondage, a rescue from death. And Christ is coming to fulfill the ultimate Passover, not just the freedom from Egypt, but the freedom of humanity from death itself, from the noetic pharaoh of the devil. You ever made iron float? Did you know that's a thing? In the Bible, we hear a story in 2 Kings. One was cutting down a tree, and his axe head fell into the water, and he cried out and said, "Alas, master, for it was borrowed." Back in that age, an iron axe head was an item of luxury. It was a very powerful tool. So the man of God, Elisha, or sometimes you'll hear it said in the Orthodox Church, according to the Greek rendering, Eliseus, Elisha said, "Where did it fall?" And he showed him the place. So he cut off a stick and threw it in the water, and it made the iron float. Therefore, he said, "Pick it up for yourself." And he reached out his hand and he took it. The fathers interpret this image, pretty much any image with sticks being thrown into things, as images of the cross. Sometimes they're made fun of. Not everything is that, but this is one in which it clearly is. The wood of the cross, which made our iron float. And our iron is our humanity weighed down by sin and death, sunk beneath the waves, if you will, is now made able to rise again through the wood of the cross. And so a big part of what we do is this recognizing the overcoming of death. And we'll talk more about this throughout the course.
Please don't do that with your vessels. Okay.
Yeah, this guy, as my daughter would say, this priest goes hard. So that's their way of going. He's really intense. And obviously he took his vestments, very nice vestments, and went cross diving, which is a venerable tradition within the Orthodox Church, to go diving for the cross at Theophany. And probably that's in a very cold place too, very cold water. Father Josiah Trenna, in his lectures on Catechism, he says this, which I find really good. He says, God is good. He has invaded our life. He has conquered death for us. He sent his son to save us, to elevate us, and to give us an incredible future. This is worthy of some dancing and some good cooking and of a good time. That's right. So you will see the Orthodox people like to feast and like to hold festival. And especially if you've never been to a Pascha service in the Orthodox Church, you are missing out. There is no party like the Pascha party. It is the defeat of death. It is joy, joy, joy. So yeah, to be a Christian and to not have joy is I don't. It's Nietzsche's accusation. The thing I have against the Christians is they have no joy. And to be fair, he was primarily talking about German Lutherans. Sorry, Jonathan. 19th century German Lutherans, which were some of the most dour people there ever. Yes, most German people are quite fun, actually. I find. But 19th century German theologians, maybe not so much. Yeah. Yeah, this Oktoberfest is still.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Is Oktoberfest a more Catholic thing?
It's Bavaria.
See?
Bavaria is much more Catholic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Catholics have these traditions too, right? They're festive people too. They haven't forgotten that. So when our humanity is saved from death, actually that's also saving the entire creation. Creation itself struggles and suffers because of our sins, not just because of what we do to it, but because while we who are meant to be these beautiful, wonderful caretakers are broken ourselves, even creation in sympathy, I think, suffers with us, not just as a victim, but as a co-sufferer. So in Romans 8, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption or death into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. So the earth is going through labor pains because of us children fighting our way to get born again, so to speak, to be renewed. And Luke says to the thief on the cross, assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. So as creation is being renewed, as humanity is being renewed, paradise itself is being revealed, recovered, restored, reestablished, reopened, whatever you want to call it. And here's a beautiful image here. Father St. Gerasimos of the Jordan is a famous desert saint. There are a number of saints in the church who made friends with the animals, who like St. Herman and St. Seraphim, or was it St. Seraphim? Seraph?
St. Sergius and also St. Seraphim.
They had bear friends. Russians make friends with bears pretty easily, though. They seem to have a lot of guys that are friends with bears. Yeah. Anyway, Gerasimos was friends with a lion, which is pretty impressive because lions are tough critters. Yeah, St. Mary of Egypt, the lion that came for her. So yeah, there's definitely the idea being that when mankind is restored to his pre-lapsarian or pre-fallen state, like Adam, he has this dominion with the animals that is, affectionate, kind, gentle, not dangerous. He shall be able to put his hand in the snake's den and not be bit.
Brought to America, St. Herman, beautiful.
Yeah. Between Herman and the bear, yeah, absolutely. Now, if there's a saint who mastered mosquitoes, that I want to know, because I'm not likely to be affected by a bear anytime soon, but every year you got to watch out for mosquitoes. So tame the mosquitoes, because they're kind of like little demonic beings, aren't they? They exist because of the fall. Is that what it is?
No.
Psalm 14 says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God, for they are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none who does good. Oh, that's not good. But that's not what we are created to be, that foolish type of person. We were created to participate, again, in God's dominion. And that means we share in his wisdom. We have a glimpse of it. And as we grow, especially through the cultivation of the virtues and the purification of our senses and through a spiritual life, we are able to grow in that wisdom and to understand, as the fathers say, we're able to contemplate, the created world without passion, without a sinful, selfish mindset. And we can start to see God's wisdom playing out in everything. We also then participate in his rulership. And surprisingly, it has very little to do with industry. It has a lot more to do with simply praying and taking care of things and living gently on the earth and all that kind of idea. Yeah. If you have a question, please say it out loud for me, because I cannot access chat in this split view right now. Unless I go.
That's okay, Father. I didn't want to break up your flow here, but in relation to your last slide about creation recovered, paradise revealed, just made me think of I can't remember which book it was in, but Frederica Matthews Green talks about sin as like pollution or smog.
Yeah.
So even if the sins that you don't see a way that they affect other people, then but it poisons or pollutes the creation around you.
Yeah.
So I
just
want to get your take on that.
It's just a totally biblical way of looking at it. If you look at in the Old Testament, the entire kind of law of Leviticus is oriented around purifying the camp. The camp is essentially the foothold of God on earth to restore holiness and humanity to earth and to bring back the nations from evil, from darkness, from idolatry. And so the whole law is oriented around purifying the space and the people so that that pollution is removed and warded off. And of course, the moral law is there to prevent it from increasing. Yeah.
Father, I'm also reminded of St. Paul says in Romans 8 about the whole creation being bondage to corruption.
Yeah.
Waiting for the revelation.
Yeah, we just had that.
Of the sons of God, and the idea that creation is like in the pains of childbirth, and that it will be renewed is very different than a very common aspect, I think, of American Christian culture, which is the world is not my home and I'll fly away.
Yeah, I'm going somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, it's a distorted understanding of cosmology, what the world is. And the Gnostics had this idea in their own way, right? That the world was essentially a prison for the soul that needed to be transcended. So we have these ideas still knock around in so many ways in modern culture. Yeah, going home to be with the Lord. It's like, what, you weren't home with me, your loved ones, you know? Well, and understood correctly, we are all kind of sojourners or all strangers in a strange land, so to speak, because yes, in a way, paradise is our true home. But the goal of the law and fulfilled in Christ is to make this world paradise. Not to flee this world completely, to be in the world, but not of the world, but to transform the world through holiness. We are fashioned to live in communion with one another. We're not created. It's not good for man to be alone. I will make for him a helpmate comparable for him, says Genesis. We are created to have this community experience. Famously, of course, Jean-Paul Sartre said, hell is other people. The good news is that heaven is other people. And the difference is how you approach it. If you approach it through humility and repentance, then you will find that heaven is indeed other people. If you have pride and selfishness and egotism, oh, other people are they're just the worst. But that's not the way to go. We are also created and fashioned for communion with God. We are meant to be that way. So when we enter into a fallen state, the fallen state is not somehow our normal state. It is a broken state, a flawed state, an incomplete state, because the complete state, one that has reached its telos, its purpose for being, is one fully in communion with God. And this, by the way, feeds into how Orthodox bioethics work, by the way. For example, when does a human being cease to have value? Because there's a lot of answers to that question, right? So if I am brain dead, do I cease to have value as a person? Am I only valuable as a source of organs, maybe? Should I be just taken off? Something like that. Or if I'm in a comatose state, or if I'm severely brain damaged in some form and I'm unable to participate fully in human society, et cetera, or I'm unborn. When does a human being cease to have that kind of intrinsic value to be worthy of the protections of life, for example? Well, we have that gets into a lot of things. So the spiritual reality of the person from an Orthodox point of view does not depend on our utility to society, but is rooted in our communion with God as image bearers of God. And so we have value even before we're born, and we have value even after we die, because our bodies even participate in that image bearing. So alienation from God ends up being alienation from ourselves, from one another, from creation itself. We see that in the story in Genesis, where because of the fall, Adam Adam and Eve have a break in their relations with each other, difficulty in their relations with each other. Adam will have difficulty even gathering food from the earth. Before it was something easy, he could receive kind of very simply, and later, well, now you'll have to sweat and struggle, and and eventually you'll die. Birth, school, work, death. That's your lot. Psalm 22, I was cast upon you from birth, from my mother's womb, you have been my God. So we understand the fullness of human life is from conception to natural death and beyond natural death. So the Orthodox Church prays for those in utero, has special prayers for mothers preparing to give birth. We have prayers for people after they die, as they're kind of in the next stage, if you will, moving into the next life. Father Roman, my blessed first spiritual father of blessed memory, a priest monk who suffered terrible tortures in communist Romanian prison after being arrested for the crime of teaching religion to young people. That was it. Nevertheless, came out of that experience like gold in the furnace. It came out brighter and burnished and purified, and was an incredible soul and a living saint. He said, orthodoxy is not a doctrine. Orthodoxy is to descend into yourself and explore the inner universe. In Western countries, there's a tendency to know things outside of ourselves. You explore the universe, you go into outer space, all the knowledge is outside. But for the Orthodox, it's the reverse. To discover the inner verse, which is infinite like an atom, and in this depth into ourselves is God, because God is not outside of yourself. So Father Braga was put into solitary confinement for a ridiculously long amount of time, like way longer than normal people ever get, like a couple of years worth total. Maybe not all together consecutively, but for months at a time. And which is just cruel and inhuman. And he said, when you're in that kind of situation, you have two choices. You either go insane, or you go within yourself and you find God. And for him, he came out of it confessing something that scandalized many people. He said, it was good for us to go to communist prison. It was a good experience for us. I mean, he said that not meaning like, all the torture and all that, but the fact that it stripped away all the externals and forced him to actually have to live the faith in its most purest form, right? To the internal spiritual journey. That for him made it come alive and made it real. But yeah, you wouldn't want to wish this on anybody, but he was able to see the blessing in it. Incredible person he was. This is also underlies our understanding of transfiguration and theosis, which are really important concepts in the Orthodox Church. We've talked about this, I think, in other places, but the showrunner for the show The Chosen, when asked, well, will you depict the transfiguration? And he said, oh, I don't know what that would add to the story, which is an honest answer, but some I've actually encountered for many years is that people, even from a Roman Catholic tradition, don't know what to do with the transfiguration because it doesn't fit in with the kind of the moral forensic view of salvation. But from an Orthodox point of view, transfiguration is like front and center. It's one of our great feasts. It's a revelation and apocalypse of what our humanity is called to become glorified, to stand at the right hand of the mighty power on high, like Moses and Elijah. So we see this in 1 John. Beloved, now we are children of God, but it is not yet revealed. That's the Greek verb. There's probably a version of apocalypse. It's not been apocalypsed yet, what we will be. But we know that when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we shall see him just as he is. Everyone who has this hope set on him purifies himself, even as he is pure. So if you ask her, why do I do this stuff? Why do I fast? Why do I pray? Why do I go to confession? Why do I need that? Hasn't God forgiven me? Blah, blah, blah. What is the hope that you have? if you have the hope that you shall see God as he is, that you will come face to face with the Lord of glory, whom no one can see and live, why would you not have this hope and set yourself to preparing yourself for it? I had a professor in seminary who was talking about this. I said, what if you don't want to see him? It's too scary, or you feel really unworthy. And he was kind of flabbergasted. What do you mean? And now I'm in that position too. I'm like, what do you mean you don't want to see him? Why wouldn't you? But many people are terrified of the encounter with the living God because he's fire consuming unworthiness, right? So be prepared for it. Live in such a way that you are able to stand before him, because even Peter, James, and John fell to their knees and could not look up. They could see him only as much as they could bear, as the hymn goes of the Transfiguration. Yet Moses and Elijah stand next to him, speaking to him face to face. So I think it's Father Josiah said, we will be exploded by the transfiguration that is to come. What we are, what we think we are, what our idea of reality is, will be totally blown out of our limited vision by what the transfiguration reveals. Yeah.
Father, have you seen the iconography from the St. Gregory of Palamas Monastery of the Transfiguration, where the iconographer put on either side of the central icon of Transfiguration the icon of Moses on Mount Sinai, and the icon of Elijah on Mount Horeb.
Perfect.
They're right adjacent, and the mountain is sort of flowing into the mountain.
Does it include them in the transfiguration the second time?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But it's, in essence, it's kind of pointing out that what they were experiencing, and I think this is kind of a mystical interpretation of the transfiguration, is that what the apostles are seeing is Moses and Elijah, as they were also experiencing, because they were entering into that kind of wibbly wobbly, timey wimey eternity, right? That space beyond time and space in the presence of God. So, but I would still say, from another kind of Second Temple Jewish tradition, Moses and Elijah are standing before the throne of the holy God because they were assumed. So they are participating in this transfigurative moment, and they're able to continue standing, which I think, and we actually talked about this in our Wednesday night class too, of sitting and standing before the throne of God, etc. Well, theosis comes into this. The doctrine of salvation in the Orthodox churches is often summarized in one term, theosis, which means deification. And a lot of people have a hard time with that. What do you mean deification? You can't become God. Well, that's not what we're saying, in the sense of we don't cease to be human beings to become something we weren't. But what we do say is that we become the fullness of the image of God, and we become so filled with the life and the presence and the energies of God that we are participating in his life. So we are deified by grace, even while remaining human by nature. We don't become God by nature, but we do participate in all the fullness of the Godhead, as St. Peter says. We'll talk about this some more in another class, I'm sure. And again, face to face, we're told that no one can see God and live. We see, but yet at the same time, in several places in the Old Testament, that's exactly what happens. People do experience the presence of the Almighty Lord. And in particular, Moses, right? Moses would speak face to face with the Lord as one speaks to a friend. This is what we are being called to do. And this is what Christ basically opens the door for many, many more people. And in 1 Corinthians, now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. This, again, the knowledge of God, we talked about this 2 lessons ago. The knowledge of God, or did we talk about last time? Knowledge of God is not just simply knowing about God, it's participating, having communion with, indwelling and being indwelt by God. And this is what St. Paul is talking about. I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. I shall fully know God, even as God fully knows me. That's what's actually being talked about here. And this is kind of Paul at one of his mystical, beautiful high points. So Father Josiah says, should you be redeemed, may it be so. You are going to know God then the way he knows you. And God knows you better than you know yourself. Thank God. Thank God. We think we know ourselves, but we don't. Father Braga had this to say as a result of living a life permeated by this reality. He said, my dear friends, I think the mystery of my life is joy. And I never tire of telling anyone or telling everyone to be joyful. Why should we be sad when we belong to the Lord? And he loves us so much that he cannot take his eyes off of us, as a mother cannot take her eyes off of her baby. God has this desire to make us participate in what he created us to be, which is to be his children, created to be his children. And that's the whole point of this, that why we're heading in this direction. Another important quote that we'll close with kind of here is Saint Irenaeus. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. And to be alive consists in beholding God. A lot of people like the first part of that sentence, right? The glory of God is a human being fully alive. And then they think, YOLO, I'm fully alive. I'm living my best life. I'm doing my own thing. That's not the point of that. The point is to be fully alive actually means beholding God. Everything else is actually diminishment. Everything else is taking us away from the experience of the living God. Everything else is an illusion. It's Maya. It's drawing us into the senses again and keeping us thinking about small things. But we're called to a greater reality. So kind of in conclusion, human nature is a wonderful creation of a good and loving God. It's not a mistake, it's not an accident, and human nature remains a good and wonderful thing. Sin, as we shall talk about in greater depth next week, sin is a temporary distortion, and we will be restored to the intended human condition, the way we were created to be. So don't say, I'm only human. That's why I don't like that mere man. I don't think that's correct. It doesn't say mere anything in the Greek. It just says, as the walking in the way of men. Don't say I'm only human. Say I'm sadly fallen, or I'm only fallen, and Lord forgive. Don't boast in it. Salvation is the journey of becoming a fully alive human being, a fully true human being. All right, so that's our class for today. We do have some discussion questions. I will take it off the YouTube though for our discussions. But if you'd like to think about this, why do you think it's important to understand human nature? And why is it significant to be understood as a created being? What views have you held about humanity or human nature? How do they affect your understanding of God, Christ, and or faith? How does the Orthodox understanding of what it means to be a true human compare or contrast to other ideas you have seen or heard? That I will leave you with and exit out of here. All right. Thanks everybody on YouTube. And for those in class, we'll have our